Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Madeon, titled Adventure. So one comment that I tend to get a lot is that you should never compare artists even within the same genre. The point behind it being that since every new musical act is trying to create a unique vision or through a unique execution, and thus direct comparisons will fall short in really capturing that. And on some level, I can see the relevance of that argument. Unless one artist is straight up ripping off the other, which does happen, let's not kid ourselves, it's definitely worth it as a critic highlighting the unique strengths and weaknesses of an act. You want to show what makes them different, what makes them special. But the more deeply I delved into this overall argument, the less I buy it. For one, when evaluating the unique strengths and weaknesses, how does one explain that uniqueness without drawing a subsequent comparison to an established act? Not only that, if you don't understand the historical evolution of certain music, you can lose necessary pieces of context and the artists themselves might be trying to create. In other words, on some level, the comparison is necessary and can even be a positive thing in order to better explain an artist's relevance, not just to today's music, but to that of the past. If I were to trace this argument even further, the whole "you shouldn't compare artists" thing, it's a very modern idea, tied to the belief that everything and everyone is unique and special, which I believe does a great disservice to artists who, in not providing that scale of quality, just levels the playing field, and sometimes that's not right. I instead would argue that success and failure comes in different forms, which links through an acknowledgement of artistic intent while still allowing a very critical eye. So why bring all this up? Well, when I started getting a ton of requests to cover Madeon, the stage name of French producer Hugo Pierre Leclerc, I saw a lot of comparisons being made with Porter Robinson, and I immediately braced myself, especially considering the two men apparently are friends. Now, when I initially covered Worlds by Porter Robinson last year, it wasn't so much that the album was bad, just it did nothing for me. Trying to balance a very lightweight, twee tone with overweight EDM, choppy percussion, and a lot of unrealized potential thematically, to say nothing of some naked comparisons that could be made to other acts very much in his genre. Now, it seems like Madeon was sidestepping some of the immediate comparisons, mostly by getting several artists to feature on this album directly. Immediately, I just did not have a good feeling going into this record, but I figured I might as well give him a fair shot. Just because Porter Robinson didn't resonate with me at all doesn't mean that Madeon's Adventure will fall in the same category, right? Well, here's the thing. To some extent, I would place Adventure by Madeon in the exact same category. It's not my thing, doesn't really resonate with me, I don't really see the appeal. And this record has been sitting with me for a while now, as I've been trying to really process it and understand it. And you know what? After a couple listens, I think it's starting to click. I'm not sure I like it all that much, but there are pieces here that I can appreciate for their quality. In other words, it's actually a little bit better than I was expecting. So to explain all that, let's start with the instrumentation and the production, which might seem to fall into the same overproduced brand of synth pop EDM that Porter Robinson resides, but with a few crucial differences, most notably in the choice of synth tones and beats. While there is more reverb and fuzz on the edges of worlds to enhance more of that distant, otherworldly vibe, Madeon's synths are much cleaner and vibrant, not quite the gleaming punch of a band like Church's, but almost runny and liquid as they flow together across the arpeggios and progressions. There still is reverb and elements of some chiptune along the edges that do add some more roughness, and yes, of course, it does feel a little bit overmixed and a little bit too busy for my personal taste, but even those elements are significantly crisper and never used to obscure the vocals, which is much more prominent. And here's where the percussion comes in. Don't get me wrong, there are still thicker progressions that I like, but for the most part, the drum machines are much thinner and choppier, almost seeming to break the synth and vocal line apart instead of actually playing through another note. Or if there's a melodic change, it seems to be more driven by that jittery percussion than by a natural progression on its own, which might be necessary to drive a clean break with a runny sort of synths, because there are some tracks that the progression just kind of bleeds across, and honestly, it doesn't sound that good. And this is arguably where we run into the biggest problem that I do have with this album. For as much as it tries to build to a good rollicking groove, by linking the percussion and the melody like this, the mix feels simultaneously very jittery and also kind of clunky, spasmodic as it flutters back and forth, yet unable to build a lot of real momentum thanks to the synth tones that lack a lot of tightness. It doesn't help matters that so much of the melody, especially when driven from vocals, is driven by pitch shifting, which I just don't like or find all that appealing. I'm sorry, just not my thing. All the more frustrating is how Madeon tries to shift his mix to better suit his guest vocals by making it sound more like their bands, which instead of forming a good fusion, instead only highlights how awkwardly it fits with some of them and how much much more I'd rather be listening to them. The easy example of this, La Lune with Damn Smith from Bastille, where the synth tones are deeper to match the choral multi-tracking for the verses, where the synth melody after the chorus clumsily dribbles through. That's before the pitch shifting of the backing chorus, which does not sound good. It sounds too high, all which lacks that thicker bass and textured percussion that made Bastille stand out in the first place. Now granted, Pay No Mind with Passion Pit, it fares a little bit better with a rollicking new disco groove, but the percussion can feel very clipped on the verses and chorus. Then the vocal production makes frontman Michael Angelicos, it makes him sound like Owl City. Hell, so does Mark Foster on Nonsense. And honestly, it's one of the few times I can actually tolerate Mark Foster's voice, mostly because he stays more in his lower range. Really, this album gets a lot better with more actual tightness courtesy of guitar lines like on Beings and especially on Pixel Empire, or the thicker synths like on the darker heft of the Depeche Mode reminiscent Imperium. Either that or just letting the synth tones drift and flow more freely with less percussion, like on the Aquilo supported track Innocence. As for Madeon himself, whenever he gets behind the microphone, his voice is often so masked and warped pitch correction and shifting to be rendered almost anonymous, with, of course, the single exception of Home, the song where Madeon's exhaustion drives him to make one of the most exultant tracks on the album, and honestly, one of the best. So okay, what drives that exaltation? Well, much of this leads into the lyrics and the themes and the overall arc of this album, if there even is one. Now, as I've said with synth pop in the past, if the music's good enough, the lyrics can kind of be irrelevant and most people won't care. But there does seem to be a little bit more going on within some of these tracks as a whole in this album. The album begins with the songs implying a love from the past returning to our protagonist's life. And although he's very distrustful of it, he re-engages for a whirlwind romance that they neither can quite understand, trying to recapture old days that ultimately leaves both of them frustrated and exhausted by her free spirit and his desire to find out who he and she really are. And unsurprisingly, like most old flings, it seems to end with a breakup. Still with a connection that goes beyond words, but something that they just can't quite sustain. In other words, there seems to be a lot of direct parallels with the debut album from Bleacher's Strange Desire last year, until you realize that the final track, Home, focuses more on Madeon's relationship with the music and the creative process itself. And you know what? This got me thinking. Was it possible that Madeon was not referring to some actual girl, but his own creative muse throughout this album personified as a girl? Wouldn't be the first time that an artist encapsulated such a thing in the context of a troubled relationship, and the lack of greater actual details surrounding the girl and the relationship could imply some greater abstraction here. And on a certain level, it does kind of make sense. A flighty muse that Madeon distrusts because he knows how it can consume him, where he encourages her and himself to pay no mind to everyone else, even though it's never quite the same, going back to those old ideas, fighting to get her back despite the abuse, even though he knows he'd ultimately be happier if he let her go. In either case, even though I suspect the second interpretation might be a bit of a stretch, it does definitely feel like an adventure, so at least the title fits. So in the end here, I'm not gonna say I even love or even like all that much of Adventure by Madeon, but I have a firmer grasp on it and I get the appeal. It's jittery, runny, and doesn't really flow well. Most of the guest stars aren't at their best against this particular brand of production, but it does feel a lot like a cohesive project and does show a lot of opportunities to grow and improve. And believe it or not, I actually think the lyrics might be one of the bigger strong points on this album, which is always a welcome touch when you come to more electronic music. In other words, I think I'm going to give this album a very light 6 out of 10 and something of a recommendation. Keep in mind, this music is not my thing. If you're more of a fan of Porter Robinson's brand of glossy synth-pop EDM than I do, you'll definitely like this. Otherwise, well, at least the title's accurate. It was certainly an adventure. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Bit of a quick review, but hey, that happens with this sort of album. So what do you guys think? A lot of the same opinions or a little bit different? I know the Porter Robinson one got a lot of criticism, so I'm curious where you guys fall on this. But if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.